I use DLSS upscaling and I'm not afraid to admit it, but is it really free performance as some people like to say, or are we paying the price for getting a few extra frames? I guess by the end of today's video, we're going to find out together. Some might say using upscalers like DLSS can result in better image clarity compared to native rendering, and in a lot of titles today that are using pretty shoddy TAA implementations, particularly on the Unreal Engine, I kind of think that might be the case. But with a popular resolution like 1440p, can DLSS really provide a better image than native? Well, to find out, we've tested at 1440p, but I've also used quality and balanced upscaling, as I don't really recommend using performance in basically any case. And for the testing today, we've used our main PC, which has an RTX 3080 10GB, and we've also using the latest Nvidia Game Ready driver and all of that sort of stuff. So let's get into the results, eh? Cyberpunk is up first with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, and the 3080 does kind of struggle at native 1440p, but quality upscaling does come in clutch with 67 FPS on average. That's a hefty bump over native. Also, the 1% lows are looking pretty good here, and even when we switch up to balanced, 78 FPS for that average frame rate and 64 for the 1% low is looking pretty decent. So you're getting a hefty chunk of performance when you're using upscaling, but are you losing any clarity? Well, one thing I can say for sure is DLSS looks absolutely brilliant in Cyberpunk. This doesn't come as a surprise to me, as Cyberpunk is an Nvidia sponsored title, so the DLSS implementation is going to be quite good here, and that it is because quality certainly looks better than native. If we punch in the static shot, it's like kind of night and day, especially with DLSS on 50% sharpness, which to me I believe is the sweet spot. And balanced DLSS is looking pretty close to native, so this is a massive win at 1440p in Cyberpunk. And another benefit that quality upscaling has is it doesn't really have the ghosting effect, which is quite prevalent at lower frame rates. So if you really hate this effect, the higher frame rates of quality or even balanced upscaling will certainly help out here. But moving to the, moving shot, it's really hard to tell between all three of these. I think quality looks slightly better than native rendering, but the extra frame rate that is provided by quality is just a no-brainer here, and in just normal gameplay you won't really tell the difference. At least I couldn't, even while pixel peeping. So in Cyberpunk, honestly, here's what I'd do. If you're GPU bound in Cyberpunk at native resolution, just enable quality DLSS. It's basically free performance, and it even looks better than native, so you're getting a better, sharper image with more frame rate, so why would you not enable DLSS here? And if you need even more performance in a pinch, balanced upscaling also works quite well at 1440p, so I wouldn't shy away from it if you need those extra frames. But if you are CPU bound, enable deep learning anti-aliasing. This replaces the pretty bad TAA anti-aliasing here, so that's what I'd recommend, even though it takes up a bit of performance, I've noticed, so that's one thing worth keeping an eye out open for. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is up next, and this game's pretty notorious for its poor TAA implementation, but the performance with upscalers is a nice benefit in this game. Albeit native is definitely playable if you like to play on a controller, because 59 FPS is really not that bad, especially when you're rendering on the Epic preset with ray tracing on a 3080, not too bad. But quality upscaling gives you quite a hefty chunk of performance, and it does help out that 1% low as well, and then balance pushes this even further, but the law of diminishing returns is starting to set in here, and the performance isn't mind-blowingly better than quality, for instance. And as for the image quality, it's not as night and day as Cyberpunk, but I do believe quality upscaling is still looking better here, as TAA in this game is just not great at all. Especially if we look at the foliage, DLSS quality is rendering it slightly better in my opinion, and then balanced is not looking as great. It's a bit more blurry and mushy, especially with all the twigs and that sort of stuff. And then when we even look at Cal, it's looking fairly like frizzy, especially around his hair on native, but when we go to quality, it's looking ever so slightly better. And when you pair that with the fact that you're getting a hefty performance bump here, I think quality upscaling is definitely the way to go in this game. And then in a moving scenario, it's basically the same story as static, yet it's harder to tell. Even with pixel peeping, I couldn't really make out that much of a difference, to be honest. So what I'll do here is just enable DLSS quality and just call it a day. Balanced doesn't really net that much performance over quality anyway, so I don't know why you'd use that for a slightly worse image, but it's about on par with native, so you can sort of pick your poison. But either way, all of these look pretty decent, especially when you're not pixel peeping, and if you're just playing the game, you're not really going to notice anyway. DLSS is getting that good now. Just like usual, Hogwarts Legacy does benefit quite a lot from, well, upscaling. Who would have thought Unreal Engine, right? But what I can say is quality upscaling sees a very healthy performance bump over, well, native. And then balanced is just not really netting any more performance, but it does clean up those 1% lows quite a lot, so that's worth mentioning, right? Looking at the image quality, and I had to change the sharpness slider in this game to 20% down from 50 because 50 just looks really over sharpened and bad in this game, but around 20% is pretty fine. Luckily, this is a user preference setting. It doesn't affect the performance or anything like that. You can set this to what you want it to be. But what I can say is that native looks kind of fuzzy and noisy, especially in the windows on the side of Hogwarts. You can see it's just noisy. You can see like loads of speckles and stuff like that. But on DLSS quality, this basically goes away and it looks really good and nice and sharp and nice and stable as well. However, on balance, this fuzziness starts to return and the overall image quality does start to drop ever so slightly. So what I'll do here is go with DLSS quality. It looks great, better than native in fact, and the rest of the image is looking relatively sharp. I admit it is hard to match up the lighting scenarios in Hogwarts Legacy. It's got random weather and time of day and that sort of thing, so some of these might be slightly off. But in the moving scenario, what I can say is they all look pretty great if you're not pixel peeping, and if you're just playing the game, like casting spells and eradicating wizards and that sort of thing, I don't think you're going to be having any problems with either three. Personally, what I do in Hogwarts Legacy though is I use DLAA, as I don't use ray tracing in this game personally, and I don't need the extra performance that DLSS quality provides, so DLAA looks absolutely brilliant in this game and I'm having quite a good time playing through it right now. But if you need a performance jump, DLSS quality is the way to go here. God of War Ragnarok is an insanely optimized game, and to be honest, I think most people won't need upscaling here. Because at native, we netted 106 frames per second on an RTX 3080, which is really good. And then upscaling pushes this to high refresh rate territory with 141 FPS on average, with a solid 1% low as well. And then balance doesn't really push this any further. I think we were starting to get a bit CPU bound, even with a 13700K here. But unlike other games, I think native rendering is definitely the sharpest in God of War Ragnarok. Pixel peeping in a static scenario, you can see as the flame in the background is much sharper at native compared to even DLSS quality, and then DLSS balance, it kind of just like falls apart. But admittedly, this is while pixel peeping, and if you go out of the scene, they look pretty fine across all three of them. But judging by how optimized God of War Ragnarok is, I don't think you'll even need upscaling anyways. Yeah, like the native TAA implementation is really good in this game. And then in the moving scenario, it's really hard to tell which one is the best here. Probably I'd like to go with native, but even while pixel peeping, it's really hard to tell. And if you're in gameplay, you're not really going to notice. So here's what I'll do in this game. If you've got a fairly competent graphics card, you can get away with native rendering pretty easily here. But if you need to use DLSS, especially on quality, it really doesn't look that bad as long as you're not pixel peeping. And even then, when you were pixel peeping, it still didn't look that bad. So just use whichever one matches your desired performance level and call it a day. So, can you argue that DLSS upscaling is free performance? Well, I guess depending on the game that you're playing, yes. A lot of games these days have horrible temporal anti-aliasing, which looks kind of fuzzy, especially in Unreal Engine games, and DLAA, which is coupled with DLSS, overrules this, and it makes the image look much sharper. Pair that with the fact that you've also got a sharpening slider with DLSS, and you can tune the sharpness to your liking. And when you pair that with the fact that it's kind of hard to tell that you're using upscaling in the first place, that's got to go for free performance, or at least cheap performance at least. DLSS isn't perfect, however, and I've got a few issues with it. And the first one is, if you're CPU bound and you're using the upscalers, you won't really see a substantial performance benefit. This is because it renders at a lower resolution, therefore it makes the GPU's job a bit easier, and that makes the processor's job a bit harder. So you won't see any extra performance going with this route. And this is where I'd recommend deep learning anti-aliasing, as that doesn't really take away performance. Depending on the game, it did in Cyberpunk for some reason, but you'll still get the sharpness improvements, and you won't have to use temporal anti-aliasing, which is pretty terrible for the most part. And then the one that you're all expecting, a lot of developers seem to think that DLSS and other forms of upscaling are a replacement for optimization, which is simply not the case. DLSS is an improvement for us gamers if we need a bit more frames at a low cost. But I think today we've shown that DLSS upscaling is a pretty decent technology, and it definitely benefits gamers with RTX graphics cards, and it helped my RTX 3080 at 4K, which you can watch in a video up there. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.